For this particular recording, for Neon Guts, Pharrell produced it in LA. Lil Uzi Vert actually went out to LA to work with him. Pharrell has he has a very minimal approach to production, so he doesn't put a lot of instruments in his music. The first thing I do is I try to see what vibe and structure they have going on before I start moving any faders or touching anything, because they had to get it to a certain place and a certain vibe to even like the song and to feel like it was, worthy of mixing. So my approach is to kind of build on top of the relationship they have going on.
And I got a colorful aura, like I got neon guts. And I got a colorful aura, like I got neon guts.
In most of today's hip-hop driven pop music, the 808 sound is very dominant in our culture. It drives a lot of, just pop music in general. Just hear the driving force between the instruments. So like with 808s, I start off using things that can kind of help accent the low end. One of my go-to favorites for that kind of thing is the low air, just to kind of give it that oomph, to kind of really get in there and shape that low end, shape the roundness of how thick I want that 808 to be. Sometimes you don't want it that thick. Sometimes you want it to thin out a little bit and almost feel like a little paper thin 808, so that it's kind of flapping, behind the kicks and stuff. It just depends on the sound of the record. From there, you can get to dial in some of the more chest frequencies, or some of even the lower frequencies still with like a SSL EQ. That's my go-to back in the day, was always on an SSL. So it's great that Waves developed a lot of plugins for guys like myself who came up on physical gear to then be able to translate our style into, working in the box and have all the tools that I'm used to, from the physical gear. So being able to just pull up an E-channel SSL Waves plugin is like the greatest thing ever, because this is what I'm used to working with for, EQs and whatnot. Same thing would apply to the clap. The clap actually just sounded how it sounded, so I was just kind of like, let's just roll with that. I have a very minimalistic approach to EQing and plugins and mixing. So for the drums in particular, for these 4 instruments, the kick, 808, clap, and the 8-bit hi-hat, it's just about getting a groove, getting a relationship to where they groove well and they feel right. And sometimes that's just adding a little oomph to the 808 or the kick with like the low air. After figuring out how I kind of think the music needs to flow, how things are feeling, a part of that feel is kind of getting in there and figuring out, okay, as I play the vocals and I hear the drums with the vocals and I'm like, ooh, I might need to use like a Puig EQ to get in there and really, sauce up the kick a little bit. I'll play like the drums and everything with the vocals and kind of see what I need to do. So let's listen to it and go from there.
You never stayed in Kahlua. I push it now on my shooter. Flooding my chain and it Gucci. I don't want that girl, she moody. I'm basically saying I'm cool.
Now the beautiful thing about Pharrell's tracks is, because he's such a minimalist, he leaves you a lot of room to play with frequencies and not affect the vocals and not push things out of the way. So here, for instance, I might want a little more chest, a little more thump on that kick. And I'll go to select say about 60 on the Puig, and then I'll start boosting. I'll just start pushing it up as it's playing and just kind of feel what I'm hearing and see if it's something that's working as everything is playing.
Yeah, you never stayed in Kahlua. I push it now on my shooter. Flooding my chain and it Gucci. I don't want that girl, she moody. I'm basically saying I'm cooler. Get Dior discounts from my cougar.
A lot of times I'll push whatever parameter I'm working with on the plugin really hard first, almost to the point where it's like ridiculous, distorting, going crazy, and then I'll back down. And then I'll kind of see what starts to make sense as I back it down, instead of always just trying to add gradually, because your ears can play tricks on you. And as you see things and think you're adding something, you might not be adding anything. but your ears may play tricks on you and make you feel like, oh yeah, I just did something. So a lot of times I like to kind of go extreme just to see if it's really working first and then back it down and see where it starts to feel good within that frame. You know, as I go through and try to find a really cool balance between the vocals and the drums, the one thing you always got to look out for is the snare, in this case, which would be the clap. And you don't want that clap or snare to be overpowering the vocals in any way, and you want it to kind of, you know, really mesh with what's happening. So again, I don't really have that problem here because of how sparse the track is. So it's easy to kind of feel where they should sit in relation to the drums. There's not a whole lot of fighting going on between the two elements, and they just kind of gel together.
Yeah, you never stayed in Kahlua. I put Chanel on my shooter. Flooded my chain and it Gucci. I don't want that girl, she moody. I'm basically saying I'm cooler. Get DR discounts from my cougar. Back in the 6th grade.
Here we are in this part of the mix where it's about the music, about the instruments. In this particular song, we have an arp, some keys, some vibes. These are all the like groovy, vibey, low, mid to mid frequencies of the song that kind of give it the body and the meat. Things like that. A lot of times you'll tend to see either mix engineers or recording engineers sometimes. They'll roll off some frequencies. They'll come down here in the 70s, roll off some of this low-end stuff. A lot of times what happens with low-end information and mixes in general is when you have tracks on top of tracks on top of tracks on top of tracks, all of that information tends to get a little muddy. And so what the advantage of rolling off some of those lower frequencies on multiple tracks, like here you'll see it, let's just solo the keys that it's rolled off on. Because a lot of those grimy frequencies in there, it's more about the notes than it is the feel of the low end. So it's okay to roll some of that off to really get the notes in there. And then you have like the vibes. So we have, and as you start to add those frequencies up and add those things in, you don't want to get things too muddy. If you find that you want to kind of maintain the integrity of how things were blended and the feel and da-da-da, you can then even take a more drastic approach at the end of it all. Let's solo those particular things. Let's solo keys, let's solo vibes, let's solo the ARP. So all the musical things, you can then take a more drastic approach overall on the main aux, and I can come here with the Q10 and roll off yet again some more of the low end, you know, down in the 70s range to kind of really clean things up and keep it on the bright side. And that's one of the things Pharrell always asks for. He loves his mixes to feel, he wants the 808 stumpy, he wants the kicks hitting hard, but he wants it to feel bright. He likes it to feel light and bright. And, you know, mixing a song like this that tends to have happy chords and happy feels and neon guts and all that kind of stuff, he wants that brightness. So that would be my tool of choice for attacking that problem on an overall scale. On this particular track, the reason for using low air on a sound like that is because there's some really grimy little notes that you want to kind of make sure those notes are being heard and felt, and you don't want them left out. On this particular track, there was a little low end roll off, and then you put the low air on. Sometimes what'll happen is you put both on, and then you try to find your way between both. And I'll have both plugins up, and then I'll have the low air up, and then I'll kind of say to myself, you know, where do I want to go? Maybe I want to roll a little bit off, a little less off here. Maybe I want to, you know, punch this a little more here just to feel those notes and to feel how they're grabbing and coming through. So it just depends. You know, some of us just have weird minds and we have to kind of play with two ends of the spectrum to try to figure out what we really want out of a specific sound. And this would be the way I attack this particular sound. So Rhodes, you want that, like I said, some of those meaty lower notes to come through, and you still want it to feel bright and still want it to feel, you know, present. So you start kind of just hearing and feeling, and I may bypass the low air, see if I'm accomplishing what I want to here. And then I might bring that in. Instantly, you can hear some of those really grimy frequencies on the bottom. I might bypass this one and just see how I feel about it. And I might push some top up here just to get those little ding, the little tingling frequencies at the end. Right in there, that little harmonic of the little top end frequencies you might want to come through. And both may work well. And a lot of times it's all about your specific formula, how you want to use. There's no one way to use the low air plugin. There's no one way to use a certain EQ. The important thing about any record and the important thing about any mix is approaching it from a standpoint of how is it all gel together and make you feel. The way music makes you feel is more important than anything.
Mama said, let me see the witch. Boy, you know, light and dark don't mix. Mix it up, boy, bad luck. Sick to my stomach with them neon guts.
Higher than Elon Musk, so high stars eat all dust. And I got a colorful aura, like I got neon guts.